Hallo Miss O'Keefe, vielen Dank, dass Sie hier sind. Wir haben ein Interview vorbereitet und wir würden uns sehr freuen, wenn Sie unsere Fragen beantworten könnten. Aber nicht jeder hier weiß, wer Sie überhaupt sind. Deswegen würden wir Sie bitten, sich einmal vorzustellen.
Hello, Mrs. O'Keefe. Thank you very much for being here. Not everyone knows who you are, so would you please introduce yourself to our audience?
Hi, my name is Janine O'Keefe. I'm an Australian living in Sweden, and I am an engineer and an economist, and I've actually these days work with Fridays for Future. Most of my work revolves around the map, as well as much more organizing in many countries, but the map which helps people see each other is most of my work, and brings actually people, helps them to understand how many strikes there are. It helps journalists to find strikers. It also helps people to actually connect to other strikers. In particular with journalists, a journalist often is actually an activist. So they will go into their boss and say, there's a strike around the corner, or there's an action around the corner. And their editor will say, but that's just local. But with the map, in a few hours, they can have contact with 3 or 4 other countries, and that can actually mean that the article is now global. And that's news. And that means the entire climate movement gets to be seen far more local newspapers, even bigger newspapers. It actually spreads. One newspaper has an article, then the next newspaper needs to, well, you should get something about that as well. So it actually grew the movement quite exponentially.
Okay, thanks. Sie arbeiten auch eng mit Greta Thunberg zusammen. Wie haben Sie sie kennengelernt? How did you get to know Greta?
So approximately the 24th of August, I'm not sure exactly which day, I read on Facebook there was somebody striking in front of the Parliament. I didn't know who it was. I'd never heard the name before. And I decided when I got rid of my cold that I would go in. So on the 28th of August, I went into the Parliament and understood she was school striking for climate. And I was so relieved that somebody was making an action like this, and a strike was particularly important. The last thing I wanted to do was stop. So I started interviewing her for the day after an Australian radio station, sent those 3 4-minute interviews on YouTube to the Australian radio station, and then they actually started mobilizing and talking to people in Australia as well.
Okay. Vielen Dank. Sie haben schon darüber geredet, wie die Organisation von Streiks erfolgt. Können Sie bitte noch einmal genauer darauf eingehen, wie das bei Fridays for Future der Fall ist? Can you describe how Fridays for Future is organized, please?
Okay, well, it's organized quite differently in every different country, okay? Germany is probably one of the most organized, with a very well-structured local groups, and then regional decision-making, and then national decision-making. On top of that, we have groups which run across all nations, for example, for the Twitter account, the Instagram account, the Facebook account. Such things are more broad. And in particular, the statistics and the map, there are many people from many different countries. So the structure tries to avoid hierarchy and too many processes to actually reduce the amount of impact individuals can have. So we try to keep things as light as possible. And yet there is some structure to find your way around, to try and find groups and local groups to work in.
Denken Sie, dass Fridays for Future schon viel erreicht hat? Do you think that Fridays for Future already achieved a lot?
In my opinion, yes. Along with many other movements together, we've changed the Overton window for climate emergency, just as one example. Prior to Fridays for Future, it was 1 or 2% understood there was a climate emergency. Since now, recently, it's around 66% of the world.
Hast du vom Urteil des Bundesverfassungsgerichts erfahren und wenn ja, denkst du, dass ähnliche Urteile in anderen Ländern nun möglich sind? Do you know about the court judgment of the Bundesverfassungsgericht? That's the highest court in Germany. And do you think that similar court judgments could be made in other countries?
I think it's an amazing achievement what the German activists have achieved actually with the constitution, and I'm hoping as many countries as possible can make this decision. And we're working hard to try and spread this. So yes, I do hope so.
Ja, wie mobilisiert man denn verschiedene Generationen für den Klimaschutz am besten? What is the best way to mobilize different generations for climate activism?
I think you'll actually get different generations reacting in different ways, and they will actually coalesce together in their own age group, sometimes very well. Yet, I believe our experience, for example, in Italy, is when all generations work together, that you actually get the strongest movement. So you need both. You need people to be working in their own age group as well as intergenerational to be strong.
Okay, sehr interessant, very interesting. Reicht das Ziel, bis 2050 klimaneutral zu sein, aus, um den Klimawandel zu stoppen? Is the goal of the world to be climate neutral until 2050 ambitious enough to stop the climate change?
In my opinion, I don't see that there is any plan that is that is ambitious enough to stop the climate change we are now seeing with feedback loops. Those feedback loops are strong, we're already seeing them, and no government is doing enough.
Dankeschön. Also muss das Klimabewusstsein gestärkt werden. Denken Sie, dass Bildung einen Einfluss darauf hat? How big do you think is the influence of education on climate awareness?
I think it's an extremely important process, but I also think that we need to think of education as not just science. There's also the maths, there's the artistic side, there's the music side. We need to reach people via many mechanisms and come through. Music and art will reach people through their heart, and that's also extremely important. So climate needs to broaden and use every sense that they can.
Okay, vielen Dank. Als du anfingst, Greta zu unterstützen, was dachtest du, wohin das führen würde? What did you expect to happen when starting to support Greta? Did you expect the movement to become as big as it became?
There was hopes and dreams, but expectations none at all. The expectation was that Greta might stop, and that's why we had to do everything as quickly as possible and to make it grow as much as possible and make it stronger both for her but also for everybody, every other voice that came up, to make sure that they felt like it was worth continuing, that they were having impact.
Wo wir gerade von Greta sprechen, in den sozialen Netzwerken kommt sehr viel Hate auf sie zu. Wie kann sie damit umgehen? Speaking of Greta, in the social networks there is a lot of hate that the people bring towards Greta. How can she handle the amount of that?
There is many people, like if we talk about Greta's personal work, that is overwhelming for her. But if we talk about the Fridays for Future work, there is many people acting and working towards that. So you might have 10 or 20 people working towards the Twitter page. You might have 10 or 20 people also on the Facebook and the Gmail, etc. So there are many activists stepping up to do a lot of that work.
Wer hatte denn den Satz "How dare you" erfunden oder wer hatte die Idee dafür? Who invented the sentence "How dare you" or who had the idea for that?
You would have to ask Greta. I have no idea. When it comes to her speeches, she writes a lot of it herself. I do know she checks the details with scientists, as I would.
Und zum Schluss, was wünschst du dir für diesen Planeten? At last, what is your biggest wish for this planet to happen?
I wish that the climate will be treated as seriously as it needs to be. It's equally as serious as COVID, in fact, far greater. And my wish is that politicians will realize they have to have the citizens on board to make the change without rebelling against the changes. So my wish is that we join together and we change everything in our society that needs to change, which is very deep and very broad, to keep us under 1.5 degrees.
Okay. Danke schön für dieses Interview. Thank you a lot for being here and having this interview with us.
We're really pleased to have you here. Thank you very much. Vielen Dank, dass Sie hier waren. Wir haben uns sehr darüber gefreut.
Thank you very much. It's an honor.